very much. When I was going to Villanova and Philadelphia, I spent a couple opportunities getting to go see The Late Show with David Letterman, being in the audience there. And one of the tricks that David Letterman always had was that he kept the studio at 42 degrees so that people would be so cold they wouldn't be caught yawning on television during his show. And I appreciate the facilities folks here following his lead on that. It was also mentioned, I had the opportunity several years ago to go through this Aspen Institute program, and what they do with this is they pick 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats, each of us viewed as someone who has the potential to go on and do bigger things in public service. And the idea is they bring you together several times over the course of several years, and they have you discuss documents that the Founding Fathers created, the writings of Abraham Lincoln, different things like that. And the idea is to foster bipartisanship and foster those relationships amongst Republicans and Democrats together before you go on to do something else. The hope being that this creates sort of across the country this mood and focus on working together rather than focusing on the things that we disagree on. And in my class, one of my best friends that I went through the program through with was Becky Lockhart, your former Speaker of the House here in Utah. And I loved going through that program with Becky because we would be, these sessions would be about 3 hours long, and then we'd take a break another 3 hours and so on. You'd be sitting there and you'd have the Lieutenant Governor of California arguing with the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and you'd have the Attorney General of Florida arguing with Lieutenant Governor of Michigan. And people would be discussing things, and any time that there seemed to be this sense, this groupthink sinking in, invariably I could look over and I would see Becky listening and listening, and then the flicker behind the eyes would kick in. And you could see her smirk come up, and you could see it was like watching a storm brew. And then eventually Becky would raise her hand, and she would say something that had occurred to none of us that would blow our minds about what Lincoln had really meant, or what James Madison's real intent was, or what George Washington was really thinking when he gave his farewell address. And so I was so excited to think about what the future held for Utah and the country with Becky in it, and it just ripped my heart out when she passed away. But she loved Utah. You could see that in each of our conversations that we'd have outside of our sessions. If my friend loved Utah, I love Utah. So I'm thankful to be here with you today. I want to talk with you today about an approach that is really spreading around the United States. And probably the easiest way to explain why on earth I am here in front of you would be to go back a year. As was mentioned, I ran last year for mayor of my hometown, Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'd spent 8 years on the city council, and I wanted us as a city to be aspiring to greater things. Tulsa grew from being about 1,400 people in 1900 to 400,000 in 2000. And it was a spirit, an entrepreneurial, pioneering spirit that built our city up. And I didn't feel like our mayor that we had at the time was reflecting that type of focus. And so I ran, and I was easily the underdog. Our mayor was a 2-term incumbent. He had just come off being his most recent reelection. He had defeated a previous mayor who ran against him, who had 100% name ID and spent $4 million of her own money, and he won by 20 points against her. So little old me stepping into that race, and I look like I'm about 13 years old. My name sounds like a circus promoter. Not exactly quaking in his boots, was he? But I ran against him, and one of the things I'm aware of, similarities between our states, I think typically Utah and Oklahoma sort of compete for each presidential cycle, which state the Republican nominee will win by a greater landslide. I know that you beat us in 2008. I think we beat you in 2012. But knowing that, I imagine your primaries are probably somewhat similar to ours in that they come down to a contest over who is more Republican, who can claim to be a greater Republican, and it's a focus on that rather than the issues that our citizens are really dealing with. And that's exactly what happened in our race. My opponent ran a partisan campaign, even though we have nonpartisan local elections in Tulsa. Endorsed Donald Trump, even though I'm not sure what that has to do with fixing potholes in Tulsa. Announced that he was opposed to Syrian refugees coming to the United States, even though none of them were coming to Tulsa. And sent out, classic negative mail pieces, negative TV ads, including probably my favorite one. It was a photo of me and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama all laughing hysterically, even though I've never been in a room with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And the top of it said, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and G.T. Bynum, all endorsed by America's most liberal labor union. Well, turns out that by this definition, America's most liberal labor union was actually the Tulsa Firefighters Union. And I don't know about fire departments in Utah, but in Oklahoma, they're not exactly bastions of liberalism. And so my mom, this stuff made my mom so mad. She came into our campaign headquarters and she was just furious, and she said, "You need to go negative." And I said, "No, we're not going to do that." And she said, "I'm getting really sick of your principles." But it did present a sincere choice. And this is a choice that pretty much any candidate, and if, most of you in here have run for office, most elections, you run into this choice, which is it's so much easier in an election for someone to try and tear their opponent down and to give the voters a choice between two bad options and to hope that you are the less of the two bad options. I think this is fundamentally what's wrong with politics in America right now, and it's one of the things that we set out to try differently in our campaign. We thought, what if we run a campaign that is about what we would do, rather than how bad the other mayor is, the guy I was running against was. Rather than attacking him, what if we talked about specific things that people could measure my performance against if I were elected? Things like improving per capita income in our community, increasing our overall population. And by the way, on increasing income, I just saw this week a study, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of. Utah actually it leads the nation in the last year in income growth. So my hat's off to you. The rest of us are trying to catch up with you on that. But what if we ran a campaign that was focused on that, on specific data points that people could hold me accountable against and could track my progress if I was elected mayor? And so instead of responding with negative ads, that's what we responded with. We ran on a very specific platform of increasing per capita income in Tulsa, growing our population, in dealing with some historic issues that we have in our community, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the interesting thing that happened when we did this was that it resonated with people. We have a very vibrant young professional population in Tulsa, and the conventional wisdom is young professionals don't vote. You have to wait until people are older and they have kids and are more entrenched in the community before they will vote. But our thought was maybe young people don't vote because in most elections they're asked to choose between two bad options where the two candidates have spent the whole time throwing mud at each other. What if we gave them something to aspire to? And they reacted to that. They responded to that. We increased young voter turnout in our campaign and our election by taking this approach by over 50%. It resonated with our business community. Business leaders are used to competing in an environment where you have very clear measurements of success and failure. If you're profitable, if you're growing your business, you are succeeding. And if you're not doing those things, it doesn't matter what terrible things you say about your competition. It's very transparent if you're winning or losing. And so it resonated with business owners and business leaders in our community. And so as the election went on, this sort of snowball effect took place, and by election day, I won the election by 17 points without ever having run a single negative ad against my opponent. Now, why is that a novelty? After we ran a campaign like that, I got invited to speak at national conferences in DC, was portrayed in our local media as this anomaly. Why is that unusual? Why do we allow ourselves to fall into the trap of accepting a reliance on philosophical disagreements rather than focusing on true measurements of success and failure? Well, fortunately, there's a growing bipartisan movement around the country that is trying to do the latter, and I want to talk with you about that today. I'll start with at the national level. There's a guy named Mitch Daniels who was George W. Bush's budget director. He came in 2000 and created a program, a tool called the PART tool. The PART tool they used to apply to thousands of different federal programs. And the idea was you would measure those programs by their management, by program measurements of success, whether or not they achieved those measurements of success, what the results of the program were. And if they could demonstrate success, if they could demonstrate results, they scored well. And if they couldn't, they scored poorly. The PART tool is applied to thousands of different programs. President Bush's 2006 budget, it was used to reduce funding for hundreds of different programs that could not demonstrate success. But the mistake that they made at the federal level in implementing this tool was that they used it to take money away from programs, but there was no rewarding of programs that were doing well. And because of that, it wasn't popular with Congress, and it was eventually shuttered when President Obama was elected. But Mitch Daniels took this same premise and went home to Indiana, and was elected governor of Indiana, and applied the same principles to programs at a state level. But this time, he did it differently. He took the savings that they took away from programs that couldn't demonstrate success and applied it to things that were very popular and needed programs, like increasing the number of state troopers that they had available for public safety, reducing wait times at the DMV. And so the citizens could see the benefit of applying this approach. They could see how taking money away from things that aren't working and applying it to provide better service in those areas that are could provide measurable improvements in the services that they received as citizens. Mitch Daniels was re-elected by a landslide. Today, he's the president of Purdue University. Purdue University just last month announced that this will be the 7th year in a row, and this is the time that he's been president of that school, where they will not have a tuition increase. And comparatively, tuition increases, the average across the country in that same time has been about 30% overall. And it is because he's applying the same premise at the higher ed level that he did at the state level and the federal level. And so Mitch Daniels showed how you can apply 21st century technology and measurement tools to provide better service at the federal level, state level, and the higher ed level. But the guy that really cracked the code for cities was a guy named Martin O'Malley. He was elected mayor of Baltimore. When he was elected, he had seen what Rudy Giuliani did with crime in New York and loved it. When Giuliani came in as mayor of New York, crime statistics were collected there or reported on a quarterly and an annual basis, and then law enforcement resources would be deployed based on data about what types of crimes were occurring around New York City last quarter or even last year. Well, Giuliani took that time frame and crunched it in a program that's called CompStat. What they do is they collect data in real time. They deploy law enforcement resources to places where crimes, specific types of crimes, were occurring yesterday instead of 3 months ago or a year ago. And it had a tremendous effect on crime reduction in New York City. So O'Malley, when he got elected mayor of Baltimore, thought, I would like to apply the same premise in Baltimore. And so they did. And what was amazing was, and you can go online, and it's very easy, just Google kidneys of death in Baltimore. That's what they called their 2 crime hotspots in Baltimore, the kidneys of death. And you can see the progression that occurred over just 5 years as they applied real-time deployment of law enforcement resources to the places where crimes were occurring as they were occurring. And they shrunk those crime hotspots. They cut over a decade, they cut their violent crime rate in Baltimore by 50% using this approach. And O'Malley, seeing the value of it, realized that you could apply the same premise to any service that cities provide. You didn't have to just do it with crime. And the idea, the overall idea, the premise is a very simple sequence of steps. First, identify the outcome that you want to achieve. And this is the trickiest part I think any of us face. I know I've run into this in Tulsa, and I would be surprised if you don't run into the same thing in your cities. The idea is a lot of the time when we talk about improvements in what we're doing in our communities, we talk about an increase in what we're spending on something. So we might say, you even heard it in my bio, I got a doubling of our police academies, or we're going to spend X amount more on police this year in our budget. But for your average citizen, they could care less what amount percentage increase you're putting towards public safety. What they care about is, are you reducing crime or not? And so that's the shift that you have to make in mindset. You have to think about what is the outcome you're trying to achieve. Increasing the number of police officers you have, just as an example, is an input, not an outcome. We don't increase the number of police officers we have just because we love having more police officers. We increase the number of police officers we have because we believe it will reduce crime and make our communities safer. So the outcome focus is to focus on what you're trying to achieve. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is to identify a data point by which you can measure success. So in the example we're using here, it is to say that you want to reduce violent crime in your community by a certain percent. Step number 3 is to identify a strategy by which you think you can achieve that outcome. Step 4 is to begin testing the strategies that you've determined. And it's very important when you do this. I know we've run into this in Tulsa. We have a terrible track record historically of bringing in some giant, a giant accounting firm to come in and look at how we're doing, maybe like once a decade, spend a bunch of money on it, and get a good snapshot of what we're doing. But it's not something that we can turn around and do next month or even next year to see how we're progressing. What you have to do is find those things that you can test with frequency and cheaply. And then the next step is you test your strategy that you're deploying and you see if it's working. If it is not working, you take funds away from that strategy and you put them towards those strategies that are. So in Philadelphia, another city that has taken this approach, they use this approach and they cut crime in Philadelphia to levels they have not experienced since the 1960s. Atlanta is using this same approach to look at how they can address their homeless population in Atlanta and testing out different strategies on how they can better serve their homeless community in Atlanta. And I should mention, a lot of the time when you talk about data and evaluation and evidence, I think the notion, the idea is that it is taking creativity out of the picture and you're just applying numbers to everything. When we found the exact opposite is the case. When you're focused on a goal and you have the freedom to try out any strategy there is and test it, suddenly your options are limitless on what you can attempt and focus on, the different strategies that you can try, making your community a true laboratory of democracy. And that allows you to be so much more creative because you can know in a short amount of time whether or not the strategy, that the idea, this crazy idea that you had, whether or not it actually works or not. In New Orleans, I'll give you a great example of this. They had a significant problem in New Orleans with structure fires. And I know we have this program in Tulsa, many of you may as well, where we'll provide smoke alarms in houses, and about once a year we'll send firefighters out to walk around and hand out smoke alarms. In New Orleans, they had that program, but there are just so many houses in New Orleans. They didn't know if they were reaching the right place, and so what they did was they used both census data and their fire data to identify where structure fires were occurring, and using that, combining those two, looking at the historic age of their properties, things like that, they developed a risk model where they could tell what parts of the city had the greatest risk of structure fires in New Orleans. And so then the next year, they sent firefighters out to the homes with smoke detectors to those areas that were hot spots for them that they could tell were at greatest risk of having home fires in those areas. They deployed 8,000 smoke detectors, and they didn't just go to the house and hand them to people. Their firefighters offered to go in and install them for the homeowners. And because of this, they've had a significant reduction in structure fires and damage to property in New Orleans because they utilized data that's at their disposal already and used it in a creative way. In Louisville, they've taken this same approach and applied it to vacant and abandoned properties. One of the other ways that this approach lends itself to creativity is that suddenly you're not working in a silo. There's no parochialism and claim to ownership like you run into so often in local government, where we have a tendency to say, well, the city does this and the county does this and the school system does this, and we stay out of each other's business. And yet there are areas where your mutual focus and your goals that you're trying to achieve for your community overlap. Dealing with vacant and abandoned properties is one of those. Having properties that sit dilapidated and deteriorating and vacant has an impact on crime, it has an impact on public health and safety, it has an impact on property values. And so in Louisville, what they did was they brought together their city, neighboring counties, their nonprofit sector, and their business community to work together in a program that they call Vacant and Abandoned Property Stat. And they're able to track now where those properties are and deal with them collectively. It's one of the powers of this approach is it allows you to bring all these different resources to the table that might not otherwise be drawn upon because you're not focused on who has the responsibility for carrying something out. You're focused on what the goal is you're trying to achieve, and if that's true, then all options are on the table and all parties are welcome at the table. And we're using this approach in Tulsa. As was mentioned, I'm a fairly new mayor, so I don't pretend that we're way down the road on this. No one, by the way, is way down the road on this. When I tell you about what Martin O'Malley was doing in Baltimore or what these other cities are doing, the cities that are longest in the tooth on applying this approach have been doing it for about 7 or 8 years. So if you're like me and you would like your community to be kind of at the forefront of a national trend in providing great service to your citizens, this is a ripe approach, a ripe opportunity for you to take. In Tulsa, we've started out with the goal-setting exercise. We recognize that we want to be a world-class, nationally competitive city, but we can't do that if we're scattered all over the place in what we're trying to achieve. So I think many of us have different forms of government. In Tulsa, we have a strong mayor form of government. So my job as a full-time mayor, I'm basically, the functions you might have in a city manager form. I run the city. That's my job. I run the city day to day, but our city council, in which I served for 8 years, provides budgeting and policy direction. We got together and we came up with just 8 goals. We thought we want to have a finite number of things that we're focused on. If you try to do 30 things at once, you can't get any of them done. So in year 1, let's focus on 8 things. We picked 4 things that are traditional areas of focus. Things like reducing violent crime, improving street quality, improving employee morale. We believe that our employees at the city can't do great work if they don't love working at the city of Tulsa. But we also focused on things that aren't necessarily traditional functions, at least for our city government, like increasing our population, like improving our per capita income, improving our high school graduation rates. In Tulsa, our school system is completely separate from the city, and yet high school graduation rates has a tremendous impact on crime rates and economic viability for our city. So we are now involved in that. But probably the greatest challenge that we face in Tulsa goes back almost 100 years. In 1921, Tulsa was home to one of the most vibrant African-American communities in the United States. The predominantly African-American part of our city is called Greenwood. It was known as Black Wall Street around the country. And on one night, in 1921, Tulsa experienced the worst race riot in American history, and the Greenwood section of our city was burned to the ground. Today, a child that is born in that part of our city is expected to live 11 years less than a kid that's born somewhere else in Tulsa. And so we have taken this on as a moral issue for us. All parts of the city are united in addressing this. And that's another thing that is great about this approach. When you're focused on a goal and you're focused on testing out different strategies, the partisan differences go away. On the group that we have focused on addressing this issue in particular, we have Hillary supporters and Donald Trump supporters. We've got city councilors and pastors. We've got members of Congress, business leaders, and we are all focused on this one goal, which is that a kid in our community ought to have an equal shot at a great life, regardless of the part of town that they happen to be born in. And so all of us are liberated from all the other things that we disagree on. We all can agree on this goal, and that unites us. And that allows us to bring the expertise and the creativity and the ideas of people who are very different from one another, but who share a common desire, and that is the betterment of life for these kids in our community. In cities across America, which is where the rubber hits the road in the United States, we have a real opportunity for leadership. You don't have to look very far to see a daily example of division at our national level, even in our states. There's plenty of focus on the things that we don't agree on. And yet, in cities, we don't have the luxury of sitting around talking about the things we disagree on. We have to build great communities for our neighbors. That's our job. And so I'm excited about this approach. I believe it creates an opportunity for each of us to build a better community for our neighbors. One thing that comes up a lot when I talk with people about this is cost. I should tell you that in Baltimore, and Baltimore is a big city, they did this with nothing budgeted for it. In Tulsa, we initiated it not using any new resources. We drew on the resources that we had in-house. And of course, not to say that you can't spend a lot of money on this. You all know as well as I do, anything we do in a city, there's somebody who has a great idea on how you can spend a lot of money on it. But in this, the key thing is the shift in mindset. It is not going out and spending a lot of money on it. It is being willing to focus and change our mindset to a focus on outcomes, and to then focus on putting our money towards those things which can help us achieve those outcomes. The natural progression of this then is outcomes-based budgeting. And that is, there are very few cities in the United States right now that have matured this process to where they're comfortable doing outcomes-based budgeting. Philadelphia has been doing this for several years, and they're not even comfortable doing it yet. Because you have to have your system down. You have to be comfortable with the system that you have for evaluating. But once you've developed that system and you can apply it over and over and over again, that then gives you much greater confidence in developing your annual budget to put money into those things in which you know you have a greater shot at success. And all of this comes back to, as was mentioned in my bio, this idea of Moneyball for government, which is a term created by someone who never had to run for office. But the idea is, for those of you who've seen the movie or read the book, there was a manager, Billy Beane, the manager of the Oakland Athletics, started using data and looking at how he could, knowing he could never match the budget of the New York Yankees or the Boston Red Sox, how could he still be competitive with them? It's the idea of using the money that you have more intelligently and more effectively than your counterparts elsewhere. And that's what we have the opportunity to do in cities right now.